some of that really is a soul connection. I mean, it really was for me with Hawaii, but a lot of the reason I thought I belonged to Hawaii and the Hawaii belonged to me is because I and people like me have imposed ourselves onto Hawaiian culture for a few centuries. My dad was a white mainlander who bought Hawaiian land and built on it. Every time I came to Hawaii as a tourist, I used their land and their water and their food and contributed to their culture and habitat dying out and to prices being jacked up so high that it forces many residents to live in a state of near poverty. That was my contribution to this place I love so much. It was kind of a horrible realization, but also one that I couldn't turn away from. So I knew I needed to write about that from different angles and linked essays, not chapters, so I could explore all these different aspects of the story. I also couldn't ignore the circumstances of my falling in love with Hawaii in the first place, which was being there with my family. And I couldn't ignore the fact that they're now gone and what that means. Because those things, Hawaii and family, are forever linked for me. Kids in America had a similar path. I believe in the adage that we should write about what we're obsessed with, and I've been obsessed with the idea of Gen X and its particular and peculiar characteristics since the early 90s. I originally thought this book was going to be a whole lot of pop culture nostalgia, since I'm like really, I love New Wave and I love Fisher Price Little People, and I don't know, I can talk about how really weird Land of the Lost was forever, right? And I thought maybe there was a story there, like, why are we so nostalgic about stuff? But when I really looked at that idea, I didn't see a book and I didn't even really see a good essay. It was more like a Twitter thread. So I've also been long obsessed with the idea of how people survive great loss. And this was before I had much loss, though I was already obsessed with this idea. So even going into the idea of this being a book, I was already writing about my friend's brother who became a white supremacist and died in a massive police shootout. And I was already writing about another friend of mine who lost 8 of her friends, 35 classmates total, in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. And there was a moment in exploring those stories when I realized those losses and those topics were interacting with conversations we're having today about race and terrorism and mental illness. And we were not having those conversations when I was growing up. So experiences, so fortunate that people trusted me with their stories. It was a huge leap of faith for them because honestly, I wasn't even sure where I was going with the project. It was still just loose. I'm going to write some kind of book idea. I didn't know what it was going to look like. But a couple of turning points helped me clarify and coalesce. The first was finding out that a serial sexual predator had been a teacher at my high school. And then also hearing Christine Blasey Ford's testimony that Brett Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted her. Another factor was the election of Donald Trump and how it empowered this overtly racist behavior. There's a line in the book where I talk about how people of color weren't nearly as surprised by it as white liberals. I said, we assumed that kind of racism only existed in a small number of underground niches that could be easily contained like an annoying game of whack-a-mole, where the prize for winning was a false sense of security. It wasn't underground at all. It had been there all along. I'd just been looking the other way. Of course, we can't change the past, but we can go forward with new and different understandings about our past, about what we knew and didn't know, about what we turned away from and why, about the forces that shaped us. And I think there's something especially that compels us when we get to a certain age, right? I'm 55, and I think there's something really normal and almost required about looking back on our youth. Maybe we need this much distance to start to understand it. Maybe that much distance is what we need to see and tell the truth. It's the main thing I have to say. I have no idea what time it is. Where are we on time?
You're fine on time.
Okay.
2:25. So
Oh,
a lot of time.
We have plenty of time. Okay, so we could do a couple things here. We can already go ahead into questions. I can read an excerpt from Kids in America if you want. What, a Kids in America excerpt? Okay, I'm going to read a Kids in America excerpt. I'm going to read the very first essay in it, which is called Gen X Prep. And it kind of introduction to the collection and really why I'm writing it. Hang on, quick water. We were privileged. We were mostly white, although a few of us were Black or Hispanic or Asian or Native American. We were old money and new money and not a lot of money, but the majority of us were upper middle class. In movies and TV shows that depicted schools like ours, the kids drove BMWs and Mercedes and Corvettes. We didn't drive BMWs and Mercedes and Porsches and Corvettes. We drove brand new Jeeps and Jettas, used VW Rabbits and hand-me-down station wagons. Some of us didn't have cars, so we bummed rides from the ones who did or from our parents. Our school had once been two, the Kent School for girls and Denver Country Day for boys. In 1974, they went from two schools to one, becoming Kent Denver Country Day. The school's website now says that is when our school became Kent Denver, when Country Day was dropped, but we know differently. KDCD was on our sweatshirts and notebooks and report cards and diplomas in the 80s. We were Kent Denver Country Day, aristocratic, plutocratic elite for longer than the school wants to admit. We didn't have cheerleaders or prom queens or homecoming kings, and we didn't take shop or auto mechanics or typing or home ec. We took classes that would prepare us for the SATs, that would prepare us for college, that would prepare us for a career in the professions. Shakespeare and French and European history and biology and Yale and Tulane and Brandeis and Duke. We were expected to be lawyers and doctors and architects and bankers and other people who did things with money. We would own and we would sell land, oil, stocks, coaxial cable, uranium. Only a few of us didn't go to college or finish college because we had to work, because we needed money and were needed by family. Those of us who did make it through college graduated into a recession and boomeranged back to our parents' houses and took jobs in coffee shops and clothing stores and gourmet markets and pubs. We became employed and unemployed more times than we could count. We're still counting. We were born while young men dying in faraway jungles and young people dying in nearby demonstrations, and our president betraying democracy were shown on nightly TV. We were born into the hope of the moon landing and to the despair of the murders of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. We bounced around in the backs of station wagons without seatbelts and rode bikes without helmets. We had telephones before answering machines and TV before VCRs and Dewey Decimal before Wikipedia. God bless Dewey Decimal. We watched a lot of TV. We heard new music from the radio and our older siblings and record stores where we flipped through bins and held vinyl in our hands. We watched Prince and George Michael and Michael Jackson and Joe Strummer for the first time their videos were on MTV. We celebrated the patriotism of America's bicentennial and the pride of Colorado's centennial, and we watched Kunta Kinte kidnapped and beaten and maimed by Ben Cartwright and Lou Grant and Mr. Brady. We stood in line to watch Star Wars and then The Empire Strikes Back, and then stood in line to watch them again and again. We spent 444 days praying that 52 American hostages would be safely released from captivity in Iran. We watched the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan and the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II and the successful assassination of John Lennon. We cheered the U.S. men's Olympic hockey team to win the Miracle on Ice against the USSR, underscoring that the Cold War was very much alive. We played the earliest wave of video games, Pong and Space Invaders, Asteroids and Galaxian. We lived 70 miles from the North American Aerospace Defense Command and the Cheyenne Mountain Missile Defense Center with a bunker built to deflect a 30 megaton nuclear explosion. And we were 30 miles from the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. We watched our world turn to nuclear winter in the day after in 1983. We were called latchkey, cynical, lazy, sarcastic, flighty, disaffected, alienated, easily distracted, late blooming, self-involved, aimless, apathetic, skeptical, pessimistic, self-medicating, impatient, angry, uncommitted, won't grow up, purposeless, unreliable slackers. We are the first generation in modern history to make less money than our parents. We are the last generation to live without fear of being gunned down in school. We are the last generation raised without awareness of neurocognitive disorders and mental illness in kids. We are not the last generation to look the other way or be oblivious when those among us sexually assault those among us at parties. But we suspect, my God, we hope we're the last generation that figured it seemed okay for male teachers to have sex with the girls. We are the first generation to lose our virginity when sex was linked to a deadly disease, one that our president long refused to name, much less give a shit about. We build new companies and nonprofits and technology. We write books and write code and are doctors and teachers and lawyers. We direct plays and make music and TV shows. We manage restaurants and raise families and dance powwow and serve in the Navy. It's said we're the last generation raised without the threat of terrorism, but we lost people we loved to terrorism before 9/11, before Oklahoma City. We lost ourselves to freak accidents and addiction and mental illness and suicide and rare cancers and white supremacy. We ended up in rehab and cults and homeless shelters and bankruptcy and morgues. We are Gen X prepped. Okay, now does anybody have any questions?
Well, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm from the baby boomer generation,
Yeah.
and I remember when I was a teenager, all the baby boomers saying, we're going to make this the best generation in the world, and everything's going to be wonderful when we're done, and everything's great. But I'm wondering, I think we do that. So I'm wondering what the baby boomer generation could have done to improve.
Oh my God, I think you guys actually did a ton. And I don't think that there is enough conversation, or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think there's enough appreciation for the generations that came before us. There's this very artificial, to me, it feels artificial tension between Gen X and the boomers and the millennials and the this and the that. And that I'm not really that interested in. I love a lot of what the baby boomers did. I get to be a feminist because a lot of what the baby boomers were out there doing, civil rights changes that happened, Stonewall happened, during that period of time. And thank God, and you say that maybe you think baby boomers didn't do as much as you could have. Well, you guys had some kind of fucked up circumstances happen to you, And that's the other thing that, no matter what generation if you're Gen X, if you're a baby boomer, if you're Y, Z, silent generation, whoever you are, there have been expectations placed on every generation that were not supported by the world they were spit out into. So yeah, you guys came out of the post-war prosperity, right? The baby boomers did. And that's what it was all going to be about. And sure, that seemed like a great time to try and make the world a better place. But then there's war in Vietnam. There's so many things going on. Like I said, just the assassinations alone of Bobby Kennedy, of John F. Kennedy, of Dr. King, of Malcolm X, just so many people being assassinated in such a short period of time. Watergate. Oh my God, what a huge slap that was. Just any faith that you had in the government is wrong. So I actually think the baby boomers did a ton of stuff. I don't really think that there's anything I feel like they owed me as a Gen Xer that I didn't get. Now, I also know that there are some people in my generation who feel like being a latchkey kid, so parents got divorced, mom went off to work, went to find herself. A lot of people feel like they were neglected as a result of that. That's not my case in particular. I mean, my parents did get divorced. My mom hadn't graduated from college. She didn't go to college when she was young because they didn't have money to do that. You graduated and you either got married or you went to work right away. These are what women did, right? So she went to college when I was in high school. She graduated in 1983, which was super cool. But yeah, so she wasn't around all the time. She was doing that thing. It was not bad for me. I was lucky. I was able to take care of myself very well. My dad lived nearby if anything came up. And the coolest thing was my mom was discovering feminism, and she and her friends would come and they'd sit around the kitchen table and I'm not joking, they'd have these rap sessions. And I got to be a part of it. So I don't really have a huge sense that I am owed anything that I didn't get, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, I wish I hadn't entered college with this idea that employers would want a well-rounded liberal arts education when I got out. I wish I hadn't graduated into a recession. But I mean, I think, most of us have been alive long enough now. The economy does this, right? No, none of us are guaranteed that it's always going to be up here and at whatever point in our lives. It's just kind of the way the world works. Yeah. That help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think some of the baby boomers anyway, who even think about it, like we should have solved the world's problems before the next generation.
Oh, isn't that cute? I mean, don't we all want to solve the world's problems? I mean, and we all do the most we can, and we hope we've made it better for the next generation. I don't think you guys made it worse, so that's something, right? Yeah.
One of the things the baby boomers did was show up here today.
Well, right. Hello.
No, I was going to just say, I thought your inspiration, obviously, as communicated for the Hawaii, but it kind of led to just wondering. I wonder how that got translated with the Hawaiian people. I didn't know exactly. You made so many distinctions, but in general, how were your sense of that?
Well, it's not a book that they need to read. Someone put it really well once to me, someone who was an intern for my publisher, which said, I wrote the book for the people of Hawaii, but I wrote the book to tourists, to visitors.
To deepen their appreciation.
Yeah. Because, people who live in Hawaii, they don't need to know the stuff that I'm saying. And I know that there's been a knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people, not just locals and Hawaiians, but even white people who've lived there for a long time. They say, oh, another white woman writing about Hawaii, taking advantage of our culture. Well, and that's one of the reasons why it's not a memoir. It's not about, how I went to Hawaii and found myself, through their culture or something like that. That was not my intention. And I understand why they think that.
And I really didn't jerk on that grid.
No, it's fine. You think you're the first person to bring that up.
I knew it was possible.
Oh,
But I was just
sure.
hoping for you that you had some sense of, because it was a beautiful inspiration, right? And it sounds like that, there's some good that came of it.
I hope so. And I was really fortunate that there's a bookstore on the Big Island called Kona Bay Books that really liked the book a lot. And they asked me to read for them. And so my husband and I, this was right before the pandemic. It was one of those, life is perfect and it's never going to change moments. So it's the end of January of 2020, and my husband were vacationing on Kauai. And, we got on a little inter-island plane and we flew over to the Big Island, and I did a reading there, and it was so nice. Not a ton of people came, but the people were super engaged. And the people who owned the bookstore, I mean, it was just like, it was a luau to them. And when I say luau, I don't mean like, women doing hula and stuff like that. I mean, like, it was a party, it was a celebration. They made tons and tons and tons of pork, and I had all this food and drinks and desserts there and stuff like that. And I felt very welcome. It was absolutely lovely. We flew back and it was just wonderful. And I thought, wow, this is my life. And then the pandemic happened. But I was very lucky that they have been hugely supportive of it too. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious about who the people were who did come to that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember it. So there was a couple of snowbirds who actually, just coincidentally, their daughter was in a writing group with my husband. and some kind of friends of the bookstore people, just in general, friends of theirs. Yeah. And, we had tried to, we had this hope, of course, that other tourists would come. They'd be like, oh, yeah, I want to take time out of my Hawaiian vacation to go sit in a bookstore. Turns out that is not a thing. So I would do that, but I'm such a dork, right? Yeah.
They were all howlies.
Yeah. All Howley. Yeah. Yeah, and that's been pretty much the case with the majority of people who have told me that they appreciated the book. Which that's okay, because that's who I wanted to be writing it to. Yeah. I mean, it'd be nice to be validated by Native Hawaiians or whatever, but again, that goes back to, well, that's not their job to validate me. In my experience, that's not the point at all. Yeah. Yeah.
As your last book changed Kids in America, how's your last book changed the way you look at other generations, X, Y, millennials?
Way more compassionately. Way more compassionately. Yeah. And I mean, it was just like I was saying earlier, it's like, I don't have any belief that Generation X is special in the way that we were treated or the things that we didn't get. I think that's true of all generations. And I mean, I look at the things that happened earlier in my lifetime. I wasn't, old enough to remember Bobby Kennedy being shot, or something like that. But that doesn't mean it wasn't infecting the air around me, right? It doesn't mean that the adults around me weren't reacting to that, but I'm aware of how important it is. And, I think for me, this huge connecting point between generations is when John Lennon was assassinated, because I remember that. I was born in 1967, so I was old enough to remember that. And it happened on my brother's birthday. So we had gone out to dinner earlier that night, had a nice dinner, and I went upstairs and I was listening to the radio under the covers on my little transistor radio, my little earphones, right? And I heard about John Lennon being shot. And so that's that connecting point. So if I have that connecting point, then we go forward and we go, oh, but here's 9/11, then here's this and here's that. It all connects back. Does that make sense? Yeah, does that answer the question? I mean, I think that was the biggest thing that I learned. Is just this compassion for everybody, and kind of hoping we can all just be a little more appreciative of each other and what each other's going through and has gone through to get here.
Is it still useful to divide up or to categorize the different generations and to taxonomize them and say they're like this and they're lazy or they're or they're slackers or whatever?
Yeah.
Is that useful, or is it, is there a point to that?
It's interesting because there's two different kinds of generational theory, or at least two main ones. And the main one is demography,
Right.
which is really based on this many people were born in this period of time. And that's the one that, we're often talking about when we say baby boomers, Gen X. Like, by those standards, Gen X, I think, is from 1965 to 1980. But sociologically, that's ridiculous. What do I have in common, from an experiential perspective with someone who was born in 1980? Not that much, right? And so when I'm talking about Gen X, I'm actually talking some things that are a little bit more experiential and things that definitely were a bleed over from the baby boomers about wanting and needing to do things a little bit differently. So like it starts a little bit earlier for me. I think it's interesting to have taxonomy. I think naming things can sometimes help us. I think having an identity like that can go, oh, that's what happened to me, or that's who I'm a part of. But yeah, calling entire generations lazy, or like calling all the baby boomers, like, what is it that people say? Oh, they all sold out and made money. Well, what were they supposed to do? And show me one person who's not happy about Ben and Jerry's, right? That was supposed to happen. So yeah, that kind of stuff's not helpful. And I still see lots of stuff out there like that. A lot of Gen Xers still have this huge chip on their shoulder about that kind of stuff. And I don't see how that's helpful for anybody to have that kind of thing. I think it is helpful if we examine the sociological and the economic circumstances in which a generation was raised, and we identify trends that happened and how that might have affected certain things in our lives, how that might have affected certain behaviors. Unfortunately, that stuff becomes more textbook-like, and it's not so much, memes on Twitter or something like that people can just instantly grab onto in that same way. And another thing I want to say about these kind of preconceived notions is clearly they don't count towards everybody. I mean, like we talk a lot about, well, two separate things. One, this idea that every single baby boomer was at Woodstock or protesting or things like that, right? And my friend, I have a friend who's, how old is he now? 74, I think, or something like that. And he said, there's a lot of us who are just working jobs, like we just went to college or we went in the service or we worked a job, and like weren't doing any of that. And so like a whole lot of people get swept to the side as a result of that. And then the other thing, when I think about Gen X, I mentioned earlier latchkey kids. There's all this stuff around. Gen X was the first generation who didn't have mom at home when they came home. And that is just such a white middle class idea, right? Like, have you not met working class people before? Like where both parents worked and kids had to come home and take care of the family and put dinner on the table by themselves and things like that. So that again, like sweeps aside an entire piece of society. And really, let's face it, the entire way that Gen X has been distilled and melted down is really about the white middle class experience more than anything. So a lot of stuff gets, left out of anytime we have those generalizations anyway.
I wonder, what is your next book going to be on? I'm curious what direction you're going to go, because I've lived longer than probably most people here. And I've seen everything you've talked about, but I have a little different perspective on some of those things.
Yeah.
But I'm curious now, the world we live in, with Putin and China and all that stuff happening, we're all a little worried about the future. And what is your take on what we should do?
Whoa, okay, those were different questions. Wow, that took a turn.
2 minutes to plan.
Your book is going to be the solution.
Right. It's going to be exactly the opposite of the solution to the problem. I'm going further back in history. My next book is going to be fiction. And I was talking to Joanna Rose. If you guys don't know Joanna Rose, she's an amazing author. Here she has 2 books. And her most recent one, A Small Crowd of Strangers. Did I say those in the right order?
Yeah, you did.
Came out 2 years ago?
Yep.
2 years ago?
Right before the election, in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, right before the election, in the middle of the pandemic. It was already scheduled to come out, and has some really amazing themes that ended up being even more resonant today in the political nature. Anyway, I was talking to Joanna earlier, telling her what I was working on. And what I'm working on is telling the stories of my ancestors on my dad's side, who I don't know that much about, who came over from Italy about 1908, somewhere there, and kind of up and lived in these small Colorado mining towns and up through about 1940. And the main reason I decided to do it is because I know nothing about them. And for a lot of confusing reasons, we don't have a lot of artifacts. We don't have pictures. There weren't a lot of stories. I really don't know that much about these people. And I just decided I wanted to research what I could, but make up the rest. And part of that also had to do with the fact that these were Catholic Italians in small towns, meant that the women's stories were just like not even present at all. Everyone was just a wife or a mother. That's all there was to them. And so I wanted to come up with stories about who these people really were and who they could be in the world. And for the first time, I'm writing a little bit of magical realism into my work. My previous fiction has all been really contemporary fiction, adult fiction, very straight ahead. So kind of to answer your question, what I'm doing is I'm escaping. I'm going back in the past. And I know a lot of people who are doing this right now. It is shocking how many friends of mine are writing in the past right now instead of writing. And of course, a lot of people are writing near future, dystopian, sci-fi, things like that too. I don't have an answer for what to do next. One thing. Yeah, right. I mean, compassion for each other, for everybody in this room is always the big thing. I don't have the questions about how we be compassionate to people who are terrible and who cause pain and suffering. I don't. And that's something that I think that I'm always wondering, how do we be a compassionate person in the face of that kind of thing? But maybe that's the question we kind of meditate on as we go forward. I did not solve everything. No one expected me to. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In terms of your writing your own personal story.
Mm-hmm.
It gets very personal,
yeah,
at times. How do you open yourself up to do that? So that you know that the world is going to be reading your own personal story with great detail.
Yeah. A good question. How to open myself up to it. It's scary. It's but at the same time, it's all stuff that happened, and it's all true, and it's all stuff that I'm a little, I'm not like publishing stuff about it a year after it happened. Like the physical and mental illnesses of my dad and my brother, and my mom dying. Those things are, I'm not behind me enough that it's not a constant. It's not a constant film over my lens. Which isn't to say that like, oh, I understand everything perfectly and I never feel pain over it. Of course I do. And certainly the sections when I write specifically about my dad and my brother and how messed up they got, those were the most difficult things for me to write. Whereas I might otherwise be able to sit down, write for an hour and a half, 2 hours about something else. When I was writing about them, after half an hour, I'd be like, I'm done. And not just done writing about that topic, let's move on to another. I'm done for the day. I need to go take a bath or watch Schitt's Creek or something like that just totally decompress, because it was so hard to do that. And I'll tell you something. It was way scarier for me to tell other people's stories. Way scarier putting these, especially in Kids in America. There are a lot of people I interviewed about being sexually assaulted. I interviewed people, the friend of mine whose brother had turned into a white supremacist, and lots of stories like that really scared me. It was a huge responsibility, and I kept thinking, what if I didn't get it right? What if I am doing them wrong in some particular way? And that is another reason I'm turning to fiction for my next book. I don't want that responsibility anymore, or at least not for now. Yeah.
Have you gotten any reaction from those that you did talk to? I mean, some of those people that you talked to, you hadn't seen for 15, 20 years.
Right. Like, hi, tell me about this trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody got to see a copy of the essay before it went to print. And a couple, three of the 4 people were, yes, this is good. You did a good job telling this, and different levels of thank you, or yep, it's good, go. And there's only one person I never heard back from, and that's because she was going through a big health scare at the time, and she said, I can't actually put this on my plate right now, which is totally fine. I haven't heard anything negative from any of those people. I don't. My biggest fear too was like, well, there were 2 fears. One was that I was going to do wrong these people that I really, really cared about. I was also afraid someone was going to come after me and sue me for something that I said. And so, knock on wood, that has not happened, right? Yeah, those are the big fears.
Yeah, it's a big responsibility to tell somebody else's story and make it right.
It really is.
Kind of to add on that, I'm Gen X, but I was born in 77, so 10 years younger. And particularly like the rape culture and that trauma, I felt like I was reading my own story. It was so deeply personal to me. And I just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
I really think it was one of the best books I've read this year.
Oh, God, thank you.
And
Thank you.
a lot of it touched me, but particularly the sort of date rape culture, parties, and then the letter to the professor. I feel like I experienced all of them.
Well, I'm glad it touched you. And I think, isn't that why we write? Ultimately, that's why we write, what you just said. And when I started out, thought there was going to be one essay about sexual assault. And it just kept getting longer and longer. And I knew it was going to be a braided essay. And I'm going to have this aspect and this aspect to show how much of a culture of this we created. And it became so big and so unruly. And there's so many names and so many things going on that it ended up becoming 3 essays. And that was another case of I didn't set out to write that book. But that's what the book told me it needed to be about. And absolutely, all of the stuff that happened from the election of Donald Trump, the Me Too, Brett Kavanaugh, all that stuff, I was myself floored at this. I use this phrase in the book, this ticker tape of memory that all my women friends and I were coming up with, oh, there was that one time, and then there was that other time, oh, and then that other thing that happened. All the times that we had sexual transgressions, if not right out sexual assault made against us, that we had swept it aside because that is what you did, because we had also been told it wasn't that big of a deal. And it was it was really a tidal wave of emotion to realize, oh, all that happened to me, it happened to all of us. That's what it means to be a woman in this world. It really reignited a feminism in me that I had kind of, I don't know, it's always been there, but it was, kind of not as ignited. And to this day, I think about that. I think, oh my God, I can't believe this is what it's like. Yes.
I haven't read Generation X, but when I was coming here, I read a lot of your leads about your book and how wonderful it was. And the question I have is, when you were researching for it, so you use your circle of influence, and then do you go outside to get other influence from other people, and how do you do that?
So, in terms of just the one-on-one interviews that I did, those were, I'm pretty sure, all people that I already knew or had some kind of relationship with. And then I did a ton of research just into, so I should maybe backtrack. Way long ago when I graduated from Lewis and Clark, I was a history major, and I had a lot of experience working with primary materials in particular. So I was always, so those were the other kinds of things that I was really excited to get my hands on. I was excited to get my hands on the letters, the diaries. I was really fortunate when I was in college that my history professor mentor was someone who taught us history through culture and art. So we read plays and we saw movies and we listened to music and we did a lot of things like that to really understand what was going on. And so I employed some of those same methods. And I didn't go, I'm trying to think if there was anyone that if I was like, oh, introduce me to this person, introduce me to that person to interview. I don't think there was. And honestly, I think a lot of that has to do with, I don't consider myself, I'm not a professional journalist. And I think I would have been more nervous about carrying and holding the stories of someone I didn't know. I think I would have had just less confidence in the entire process to do that. And I'd interviewed people before, like I used to do freelance magazine writing just for little local magazines and stuff. So I interviewed people about stuff like that, but it wasn't that level of personal. And I do think because so much of this book was about me looking back on my past, it was really important that I was talking to people actually in my peer group who had these things happen, as opposed to just some, other person. This was all very personal to me, all of these things that I looked at.
We have about 3 minutes left. Anybody? Any questions?
3-minute question.
I have one more question,
Okay.
And that is, you use a lot of television shows and movies and various things, and sometimes it's like episode by episode by episode, and who did what to whom. How do you see yourself? Why do you do that? What is it about using that as an example of what you're trying to say?
Well, part of it is, but not everybody, so one of the pieces of feedback I often get is there's a very long essay in here about Beverly Hills 90210 that I use to illustrate a lot of these themes. And tons of people tell me, oh, I never watched that show. And so they don't read the essay. And I'm not really sure how those two things, well, then read the essay. You're not going to lose IQ points just because you're reading an essay about 90210, But yeah, TV shows and movies are this way that we experience culture, and it reflects back to us. It has a message that it's reflecting to us, and so I'm always interested about how I can do that. Now, there's been some other cases like in Volcanoes, Palm Trees, and Privilege, where I took the movie The Descendants, which takes place in Hawaii, and it's a story about loss, and it's a story about the land of Hawaii. And my story was one about loss and about the land of Hawaii. So, it was really actually very interesting, and fun's not quite the right word, but very fulfilling for me to take that story. And I could very, very much weave that. Now, in the same book, there's also an essay about the Brady Bunch episodes that took place in Hawaii. And I do that because that was a hugely significant thing for Gen X. For a certain generation, that was what we learned about Hawaii. And it kind of, it was weird. It was a 3-episode arc, and the second 2 were just silly, but the first one operated almost as if like it was an advertisement for a tourism board for Hawaii. It was just a trip. But so part of it too is I'm looking at the culture to see like, oh, that's our lens. What did we learn through that lens? Oh, okay, that's where I got that idea from. Well, that's weird.
There must have been something about that generation that caused them to write about that.
Well, we watched so much TV, and I do think this is a big thing I talk about. Gen X was the first generation to just get plunked in front of that TV constantly, and again, we'd come home, Mom wouldn't be there for whatever reason. She's out having a real life or something. And so we would just turn on the TV and watch it. And I also think, and like MTV, it was, we were the first generation to grow up with MTV. And one of the things that happened, I think, a result of watching all this TV too, this kind of circles back around, is we have a lot of nostalgia for stuff. And I mentioned Fisher Price Little People, for instance, but we have a lot of really weird nostalgia about commercials too. And I think it's because we're the first generation where our nostalgia was branded. Like everything was like Star Wars this or McDonald's that, or even MTV, like it was a brand, and the pop stars on it became brands themselves. Madonna was a brand. David Bowie became a brand at that point. Not that he wasn't someone before.
Barbie too.
Yeah.
I forgot Barbie.
Good old Barbie. Oh boy. My mom wouldn't let me have a Barbie for the longest time. Yeah. So I don't even know where I got with that. But yeah, we watched a ton of TV. We watched a lot of movies, so I think and I don't, I think we might be the last generation who did quite as much of that too. But I thought it was an interesting cultural lens to look through. Yes.
And we didn't really have a choice. It was like,
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's true. There was something to be said about, wasn't it neat that you could actually talk to all your friends about that one program, that you'd all seen? That was kind of actually cool. Yeah. Yeah, there just weren't as many choices.
You didn't mention me. Yeah.
Excuse me, there's an entire essay in here about Magnum PI. Yeah, there's an essay in here about Magnum PI, Tom Selleck, now hawking reverse mortgages, and how a reverse mortgage ruined my family. So yeah, I got that in there.
Well, all of you have at least 2 choices. You can read either one or both books, and they're available in the library and also for sale today. So be sure and do that. And thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you so much. So should I go out there to